our country and have protected our American values. Those who've served in the military are truly heroes, as is their family. The attack on our country comes in many forms. The attack during 9/11, the Russian attack on our election, the labeling facts as fake news, and the investigation into corruption being labeled as a witch hunt. Defending American values takes daily acts of heroism. Whether it is reporting someone who's mentioned that they're angry and they're going to kill somebody, or defending those who have little voice in our society. We just honored 3 heroes today for defending our basic rights to a public education, civil rights, and equality for everyone, and giving time, paying it forward for community service. Our guest speaker today, Anita Earls, is a candidate for the North Carolina Supreme Court. She is my hero. Why? Because for 30 years, she has worked to ensure voting rights, civil rights, and anti-discrimination. She has believed so compassionately in these causes that she established the Southern Coalition for Social Justice and brought in other attorneys to try cases that otherwise might have not even gone to court. She is so renowned in her civil rights efforts that President Clinton appointed her Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice, where she was over voting, education, disability rights, and federal compliance. In 2017, she received the Defenders of Justice Award from the North Carolina Justice Center. She was also made an honoree on the We Are Emily list. And as you may know, this is a group that supports the election of progressive Democratic women. Mrs. Earls has taught at the University of Maryland and Duke University. She is currently teaching other attorneys at the Shriver's Center for Racial Justice Training Institute, in addition to running for the North Carolina Supreme Court. I'd like to introduce my hero, Anita Earls.
Good afternoon, Henderson County Democrats. I am so excited to be here. Thank you for that beautiful introduction. And I really am so thrilled. Are you all fired up? Yeah. Man, don't you have an amazing set of candidates here? Yes. And don't you have an amazing set of volunteers and party workers? This is incredible. I want you to know that everywhere I've been going across the state as I've been campaigning, I've seen rooms like this filled with people with energy and enthusiasm. So don't think you're alone. I truly believe that people understand the need to come together and to work harder. And my main message, the most important thing I want to tell you, is that I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that our democracy is in peril right now. And I can talk about how I see that through my work and the types of threats to the right to vote that I'm seeing now that I never saw 30 years ago when I started this work. I can talk about academic studies. There's a book, How Democracies Die, that 2 Harvard government professors wrote recently. And they talk about the factors in countries across the world and over time where democracies die not by violent coups, but other ways, and how right now in our country we are experiencing every single indicator. They also have a chapter on North Carolina and how what our legislature is doing is contributing to this crisis. But I also feel it when I see that we have people in power making public policy who don't think that it's important to have every voice heard in the process. who don't believe that our public policies can only be good if we involve everyone and hear everyone's voice, whether you're in the majority or the minority. And people who are willing to suppress speech because they don't agree with it. That's the risk that we are in. And what I want to say to you is that I am grateful to you because you are the people who can stop that. You are the people who can protect our democracy. So I'm mostly here to say thank you for what you do every day and to just have the chance to face-to-face thank you for your work. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I became a lawyer because I grew up in a mixed-race family. My father was black, my mother was white. And when they met and fell in love in Missouri, it was illegal for them to be married. So they moved out to Washington State, and through that experience and many others, as a young person growing up, I really believed that we could use the law to get us closer to that guarantee that is etched in stone over the U.S. Supreme Court, the guarantee of equal justice under law. So after law school, I came down and worked with Julius Chambers' firm in Charlotte, and have really been privileged to work alongside individuals like you and community groups across the state who are willing to stand up for civil rights. I can tell you, in our voting rights cases, people are not getting paid. They don't get money if we win. It's a hassle. They have to be deposed by attorneys. They have to come to court and testify. But across the state, in our redistricting work, in our voting rights work, ordinary people are willing to stand up and give of their time and effort to vindicate our rights. And so it's been a privilege and an honor for me to be able to do this work. But the biggest challenge that came to my career and to my belief that I could use the law to get us closer to equal justice under the law came 12 years ago. At that time, I was working at the UNC Center for Civil Rights with Julius Chambers, and I'll just note, I was doing things that the center is now barred from doing. I was representing communities in civil rights cases. But I got a call from my father. He was living in a rural part of Washington State at the time, and he was very distraught. He called me because a neighbor had come over with a newspaper article. And the subject of the article was that a black man had been killed. And that black man was my brother. Even though they knew my family, we learned about it from the papers. So I went home. I stood at my brother's funeral. My brother was 10 years in the Army, so he had a military funeral. They shot off the rifles in tribute to him. And I stood in front of my family and I said, I will fight for justice. I will get justice for us. So I worked with the local district attorney, the local police, and after months of effort, I was not successful. They gave me 2 reasons for not bringing a prosecution. The woman who killed my brother was arrested right after the incident. It wasn't a matter of knowing who did it. They said they would not prosecute because, first of all, it's a rural county and murder prosecutions are very expensive. The second reason I was given was that in that district attorney's estimation, no jury in that county would convict a white person of killing a black man. And so that, for me, raised a crisis of how I could continue going on saying, I'm a civil rights attorney. I'm going to work for justice. I can come to your community. I can work alongside with you. And ultimately, what I finally concluded was that I just had to work harder. And by harder, I don't only mean longer hours, although it meant that too. I meant smarter, taking risks, bringing my full self to bear, and courageously doing all I could. And so I left the Center for Civil Rights and founded the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. And for the past 10 years, we've been working on a wide range of issues, including the voting rights cases. So let me just say a quick word about redistricting. We filed a lawsuit challenging the state legislative districts and the congressional districts in 2011, and in 2012, in January of 2012, asked the state court to give us an injunction. The districts that have now been finally declared to be unconstitutional by the United States Supreme Court, both our legislative and congressional districts, should never have been used. The court did not give us an injunction. Years of litigation and effort, all the while these unconstitutional districts being used. And what's wrong about them is not only that they were racially gerrymandered, but in addition, the partisan gerrymandering implications, which means that people of color and Democrats, their voting strength was lessened just by the structure. So rigging the system to give those voters' votes less weight in the process. So we now finally have new legislative districts, and we're still litigating. I say we. I did have to leave the Southern Coalition at the end of last year to run, and I've withdrawn from the cases. But the parties litigating those cases are still fighting in the legislative cases in a couple of forums, in state court and federal court, over some House districts in Mecklenburg and Wake counties. On the congressional side, we went to trial last year on the claim that when they redrew in 2016, after the districts had been thrown out as racially gerrymandered districts, they were redrawn with a legislature that said, we will only consider maps that have 10 Republican districts and 3 Democratic districts. And the only reason we're not going to draw 11 too is because it's physically not possible. You know, like you can't move Democrats into South Carolina. So they explicitly said we're going to have a system that is unfair from the outset. And I'll tell you, when the U.S. Supreme Court heard arguments in the Wisconsin partisan gerrymandering case, 2 of the justices at separate points in the argument asked hypotheticals that said, well, if you started out with an explicit statement that you were going to redistrict on the basis of party and that you had an explicit unfair criteria, would that be constitutional? So basically, I mean, our briefs are up there. They know about what happened in North Carolina. And no one on either side was willing to defend that as a constitutional way to act. But in the North Carolina case, which was filed after the Wisconsin case, we convinced a 3-judge court, including 1 Republican appointee, that the congressional districts were a partisan gerrymander under any theory. Under a First Amendment theory that's being used in the Maryland case, under a 14th Amendment theory, these districts do not pass constitutional muster. And so there was an order to redraw, and then the U.S. Supreme Court stepped in and said, hold on. Now, we don't know why there was no written opinion. My guess is they want to decide the Wisconsin and Maryland cases first. When the Maryland case was argued earlier this year in the Supreme Court, Justice Breyer suggested that it might be a good idea to set all 3 cases for re-argument. I don't think that will happen. But the bottom line is we're waiting to hear what the Supreme Court does in Maryland and Wisconsin cases, and then we'll see what implications it has for our 2020 congressional districts. But I want to just mention Pennsylvania, because in Pennsylvania, a partisan gerrymandering case challenging their congressional districts was filed in state court. And their state Supreme Court said this kind of partisan gerrymandering that we're seeing in Pennsylvania violates our state constitution. And so they have new congressional districts in Pennsylvania, and they're not waiting on the U.S. Supreme Court. So it kind of gives you an idea of why I concluded that our state constitution is an important guarantee of our voting rights, and that the state courts are really a valuable way to try to protect rights. But the other reason I'm running is what I saw through this litigation was how the legislature, not happy with some of the rulings of our state Supreme Court, has been trying to take over our courts. Whether you look at the court packing plan that came up right after Justice Morgan was elected, they were talking very seriously about increasing the size of our Supreme Court from 7 to 9 and having the legislature appoint 2 more members so that it would go from 4-3 Democrat-Republican to 5-4 Republican-Democrat. 2 other plans include how I believe they're messing with the elections process this year. So they made this office partisan. In 2016, when Justice Morgan ran, the Supreme Court was nonpartisan. Court of Appeals were partisan, but Supreme Court was nonpartisan. This year, it's a partisan office, but they've eliminated the primaries. So that means there's the potential to have multiple Democrats on the ballot to split the vote. Now, I'm really proud of our Democratic Party. They're having an endorsement process. It's open to anyone. No one else has filed, no one else is campaigning as a Democrat for this seat right now other than me. But there will be an endorsement on June 9th. Our filing period isn't until June 18th. So I won't know until the end of June whether other people sign up to run as a Democrat. They also made it easier to do that. You no longer have to be registered 90 days as a Democrat before you file to run as a Democrat. You can go in, change your party affiliation, and file that day for this office. They also have made it easier to run unaffiliated. For every other office, even now, if you want to run as an unaffiliated voter, you have to get some signatures on a petition. And the purpose of that is not to keep people from participating in democracy. It's to make sure that someone who puts their name on the ballot has some support. Because we know when you have a huge ballot, it's just confusing and doesn't aid our democracy. You might remember, I think it was 2010, we had 19 candidates for a Court of Appeals seat. Well, no one can learn about all 19 candidates and pick who's best. So now for this seat, for Supreme Court, you can file unaffiliated. You don't have to have a petition, you just go pay the filing fee. So we don't know how many names ought to be on the ballot, but what I do know, what it really means, the final thing, it goes on and on. It takes hours to explain the mischief. Last week, there was proposed a committee substitute for a bill, so that means it would be passed up and down, no debate. Number of changes, including putting the statewide judicial races at the bottom of the ballot. So they want to hide this contest. So that means that I'm going to need all of you, like the blue wave could happen, but I could get left behind. People are going to have to know my name, and it's Anita Earls. Have to know to get to the bottom of the ballot. So that's kind of what gave me the sense that it was important to stand up for the right to vote and to stand up for a fair and impartial judiciary. And so I do need your help in all the ways that other candidates have specified. It's a statewide race. I have to get the word out to 6.9 million voters. And so that's what your dollars help me do. But equally important, mentioning me to your networks, and when you do canvassing, when you email your friends, all of that is also equally valuable. I want to leave you with something that has inspired me throughout my career, and it's a quote from Bernice Johnson Reagan. She was a civil rights warrior, I'll say, in the civil rights movement. She was one of those young students who went to jail multiple times, high school student, in the South, and she later formed the group, the a cappella group, Sweet Honey in the Rock. Yes, so Bernice Johnson Reagan. And she talked in an interview about what that experience as a high school student, being arrested and put in jail for her civil rights, what that meant to her. And I think that it was inspiring to me, and I hope it will inspire you. So she says, "What I've had since the civil rights movement is a better knowledge of who I am in this society, an understanding of my power as a person to stand and speak and act on any issue that I feel applies to me in some way and therefore to other people. I learned that I did have a life to give for what I believed. Lots of people don't know that. They feel they don't have anything. When you understand that you do have a life, you do have a body, and you can put that on the line, it gives you a sense of power. So I was empowered by the